Okay, this is our first set of notes for Unit 9. From here on out this semester, we're going to be looking at different types of chordates, which we'll talk about the main characteristics of chordates today. We'll do like an intro into chordates. And then we'll also talk about the first major group of chordates that we'll focus on, which are fish. Okay, so you should have picked up a handout when you came in. Those are diagrams. Feel free to cut them out ahead of time so that you can add labels to them and tape them in as you go. But you're going to be writing these notes directly into your lecture notebook. So you should have already followed the instructions on Schoology and set up your new table of contents in your lecture notebook, followed by this set of notes as your first set of notes. Okay, make sure you have captions going or have audio as well. Particularly when it comes to me going over the digestive system of a fish. I don't have that information written on the slide, so you got to make sure that you're recording that down. I'll remind you again when we get to that slide. But in any case, let's get started. Okay, so what is a chordate? A chordate is an individual, an organism that's a member of the phylum Chordata. We just generally call them chordates, and a chordate has to have there are four main characteristics, or four key characteristics that we see chordates have. Now, these four characteristics don't all have to be present for the entire life cycle of an organism for it to be considered a chordate. A lot of these characteristics, they just have to show up at some point in their life cycle. And so we find that some chordates possess all of these characteristics as adults, while others possess them only during like an embryo stage or in the early stages of development. Okay, in any case, here are the four characteristics. There's a dorsal hollow nerve cord, a notochord, pharyngeal pouches, and a tail that extends beyond the anus. Okay, so these are the four characteristics that all chordates have at least some point, at least at some point during their life cycle. Okay, so let's talk about what each of these four characteristics mean. Now your first diagram looks like this. Of course, you don't have the labels on them, so take a second and tape it in and add the labels. But I'm going to point out those four characteristics. Okay, so the first is this hollow nerve cord. Okay, I don't have the description of that written on here, but you can add that in. So a hollow nerve cord runs on the dorsal surface. You can see in blue here, the dorsal part of the body. And usually this hollow nerve cord will have branches, nerves branching off of it at regular intervals. And these nerves will connect to things like internal organs, muscles, sense organs to control them. And that hollow nerve cord generally towards the anterior or the cranial region is going to have the added the addition of some kind of brain or collection of nerves that acts as a main control. Okay, so which we know as cephalization. Okay, but generally that hollow nerve cord is the first characteristic that we're looking at a chordate. Okay, the second thing, well, one of the things you labeled was a notochord. The second key characteristic is to have a notochord. So a notochord is a long supporting rod that runs through the body just below the nerve cord, the hollow nerve cord. So you can see it just below it. And this notochord, for most chordates, this notochord only occurs, or you see it in their embryo stage. Okay, and then depending on what that chordate is going to develop into, it may turn into like a bony vertebral column, or I mean, there's other forms as well, but at least at an embryo stage, there's this kind of supporting structure that is usually kind of following the same pathway that hollow nerve cord is following. Okay, these right here are pharyngeal pouches, and these are paired structures around the throat or pharynx region. Okay, remember the pharynx is kind of just like the entrance is the mouth, and just past the mouth would be the pharynx region. Okay, so in some chordates, like fish or amphibians, like frogs and toads. Okay, slits might develop. You can see actually these slits in this pharyngeal pouch right here. Slits can develop, um, and these slits will open up to the outside. Okay, in a lot of those type of organisms, like fish that we're going to talk about today, and amphibians, these might develop into gills that could be used for gas exchange. Okay, um, even us as chordates in the embryonic stage, we have these pharyngeal pouches to start, and then eventually these will develop into other things like, well, for us, for respiration, it would be lungs, but they start out kind of in this form. Okay, and then the last structure was a tail, and a tail can so all chordates at some point in their life have a tail. Even humans in the embryonic stage has a tail. And remember, by definition, it's just an extension past the anus. So here's the anus here. The tail can contain bone and muscle. For a lot of aquatic species, it's used for swimming. Okay, so those are the four main characteristics. Now, the majority, about 96% of all chordate species, are what we call vertebrates. And so a vertebrate has this distinction in that the notochord develops into something called a vertebral column. And a vertebral column, or spine, is a common name for it as well. Is made up of these vertebrae, and vertebrae serve two functions. They can provide support, extra support, better than a notochord can. And then a lot of cases that vertebrae is hollow. There's like a tube kind of running down the middle of them. Humans, for example, our vertebral column has like a channel kind of passing down the middle, kind of like a string running through a bunch of beads to make a necklace. And so that hollow area is a place where something like a spinal cord can travel through, and so the vertebrae provide protection as well. So those are the two functions: support and protection. Um, as a vertebrate embryo develops, the spinal cord, the front end of the spinal cord might develop into a brain, and then the backbone or vertebral column is what replaces that notochord that that all chordates kind of start with. Okay, so in vertebrates, that dorsal hollow nerve cord, however, develops into that spinal cord, and then that spinal cord kind of travels through the vertebral column. Okay, so just to kind of give an overview of what we're going to be looking at over the last few weeks of school, this is kind of an evolutionary, a proposed and well accepted evolutionary tree scheme of how chordates are related to one another in terms of their evolutionary history. And you can see that there's quite a lot of branches here, but they go generally from left to right. They go from simple to complex. Now you have this diagram to add in, but obviously these blanks need to get filled in. Today we're gonna glance at these a little bit to start, and then we'll talk about bony fishes and sharks. Amphibians, I think, will eventually be part of this unit as well. But we should note that all of these chordates do come from some kind of invertebrate ancestor. Okay, and so we're gonna look at these first. These are non-vertebrate chordates, and jawless fishes are the simplest of them. They kind of look a little funny. They don't look like the normal kind of organisms that we're used to that have a backbone. These from sharks up until mammals, these count as the 96% that have an actual backbone, um, or vertebrates. Okay, but these two here are non-vertebrate chordates. Okay, so they don't have a vertebral column, even though at some point they do have all of the characteristics of a typical chordate. Okay, so let's look at those two groups. So non-vertebrate chordates, there are two subphyla that do not have a backbone. There are tunicates, which are these right here. If you've heard of sea squirts before, that's kind of their common name. But tunicates are one type of non-vertebrate chordate, and then you have lancelets, which are right here. Okay, and both of them are soft-bodied. Oops, that should be soft-bodied. My mistake. Marine organisms. Okay. And again, they look very, very different. In fact, tunicates are often confused for sponges, um, like sea sponges. But if you were to take into account the way that they develop, like from an embryonic stage, you would find that they are very similar. They fall under chordates because they develop those four key characteristics, um, at least at the earliest stages. Okay. In any case, we're going to look at, I'm just going to backtrack here. We're going to look at these next. That's all we need to talk about in terms of non-vertebrate chordates. We're going to move on to fishes for the remainder of these notes. So what is a fish? Fish, first of all, there's a ton of variety in terms of what counts as a fish. We're going to find that there are 3 subgroups within fish, but for the most part, they are aquatic vertebrates. And their main characteristics are they have paired fins, they have scales, and they have gills. Now, not all fish have all of these characteristics. Just keep that in mind. However, like for example, catfish don't have scales, but they have the other 2 traits. But these are common for the majority of what we would consider a fish. Now, the fins, I don't have it here, but like what they do, but you can see that there's a variety of them, dorsal, lateral, and so on. These fins, their main job is for movement. So just like you would use a paddle to kind of steer a boat, these fins act as rudders and paddles to help the fish to move. In terms of the scales, which cover the body, their main purpose is protection, which makes sense. They're like hard and act as like a flexible kind of skeleton. Oh no, not skeleton, suit of armor. And then the third are gills, which we can't see on this diagram, but they're underneath this flap. This flap is called an operculum, and underneath, we'll see on another diagram, there are structures there that are used for gas exchange. Okay, so a little bit about the history of fishes, or the evolutionary history. So the earliest fishes appeared in the fossil record about 510 million years ago. Okay, and these were very odd looking. They didn't have jaws. Their bodies were very heavily armored. This is an example of one of many different types of fossil fish that have been discovered and found in the fossil record. But then around 505 maybe to 410 million years ago, it was a huge evolutionary change. And there were branches that happened in the evolutionary tree. So some of the jawless fish branched off to become ancestors to one branch of fish that we'll talk about. Hagfish and lampreys fall into this group. Again, more on them later. And then some branched off in the evolutionary development of jaws. And that was a really big step when it came to development and complexity. Okay, the evolution of jaws in fish was very useful. A jaw, right here, can hold teeth. Okay, it can be supported by muscles that makes it possible for the fish to be able to eat a wider variety of foods. Jawless fish like hagfish and lampreys, which still exist today, they're modern day fish, because they don't have that structure, they don't have a rigid kind of tough framework where teeth can be attached and muscles can be attached. They're kind of limited to eating small particles of food. They either filter them out of the water or they suck them up like a vacuum, but they're very limited in what they can eat. And once fish ancestors were able to develop this jaw shape that's supported by rigid structures made out of like cartilage and so on, and bone, then it became possible for fish to just make use of a wider variety of foods. Okay, in addition to that is having the ability to bite made it easier to defend themselves, so they could fight back against predators, um, and so that became another advantage. Okay, now I don't have it on here, but as the evolution of jaws happened, what also happened was, well, it was accompanied by a development of these pectoral fins, like these here, and pelvic fins, and so on. And these fins attach to girdles. Girdles are like these cartilage or bone structures, internal structures that provide more support. And these fins gave the added advantage of being able to have more control in body movement. Okay, so it made fish better at swimming, better at chasing prey if they were predatory fish, and so on. Okay, so the early jawed fish disappeared, um, and eventually left behind two major evolutionary groups. And these are two major groups that we still see today. Okay, so the first group, which are the ancestors to modern sharks and rays, are distinct in that their skeletons are actually made out of cartilage. And cartilage is the same stuff that we have cartilage in our own bodies. It's not as hard as bone, and it's used to support softer tissue. So if you think about like the bridge of your nose, or what gives your ears their shape, if you try and bend your ear or kind of wiggle your nose, you can feel that there's some structure underneath the skin, but it's not as tough as bone, and that's what cartilage is. That's you have cartilage in those areas. The other major group is other fish that did develop skeletons made of true bone. Okay. So let's look a little bit at the form and function of fish. We're not going to go into too much detail about um, all the different life functions of fish. I'm just going to point out some main characteristics that kind of stand out. You can always refer back to the textbook on page 771 if you need to get more details of these things. Okay, now the next slide, you don't have to write what's in the brackets, you don't have to write down. But I should warn you, the next slide has a diagram of a fish, and you have that diagram that you can cut out and tape in. I would warn you, however, it's going to have a ton of labels on it. And you don't necessarily have to write all these labels down, because eventually we'll have a virtual dissection. However, you should know that it's available on page 774 of the textbook. So if you ever need to go back to it, you can. If you do want to label all of it, I do encourage you to, just because it's easier for you to access in your notebook versus going all the way to the textbook. Okay. One thing that you will have to add as you are following along with me, though, is I want to point out the pathway that food travels as we look at the diagram coming up. Okay, and I'm going to just talk about it in the audio, so just make sure you jot down the pathway that food travels. Okay. All right, so here is that diagram. Like I said, you have it to fill in. Okay, but on page 774 of the textbook, it's there as well. Okay, so in particular, what I kind of want to point out to you are some structures. Well, there are some things that we've already pointed out, like the spinal cord and I don't think I've mentioned the fin. I don't think I've mentioned all the fins aren't labeled in here. But anyway, the pathway of food, and just because this will be important when you do your dissection, food travels in through the mouth, and it'll go through, it'll eventually reach something called the esophagus. And this is a scheme, this is a plan that you're going to see comes up all the time with chordates. So we're going to trace this pathway in this set of notes, and you'll find whenever we look at a new organism, a new group of chordates, the same pathway exists with a couple of variations. So usually food goes in through the mouth, goes through a tube called the esophagus, and then makes its way to the stomach, which is right here. Now, in fish, there is something that you can see here called a pyloric cecum, and ceca or cecum. There are these like little finger-like things, finger-like pouches. These, if you recall ceca from other organisms that we, like invertebrates that we talked about in the last unit, these produce gastric juices. So they produce enzymes that can be used by the stomach to break down food. They also produce certain enzymes that will help with absorption of nutrients later on. But in any case, so the stomach is the next spot. Food is broken down there, and then eventually that food, once it's all broken down, what's next is to absorb whatever can be useful. So that food then goes through. You can see this long tube here. This is the intestine. That would be where absorption takes place. So all the nutrients and good things that the fish can use from its digested food get absorbed and get into the bloodstream that way. You'll notice some other organs along the way. There's a pancreas here, a liver, gallbladder. These three organs in particular produce certain enzymes and chemicals that will help with either breaking down food further or helping to absorb certain nutrients better. Okay, and eventually as the food kind of travels, they're treated to all kinds of those chemicals to help absorption take place, and then eventually whatever doesn't get absorbed goes out the anus, okay, to finish off the digestive pathway. Okay, so like I said, you're going to see that pathway reoccur with all the notes that we do because it's a common scheme for all chordates. Okay, so one thing I should point out, or you've already labeled it on here, the gills and operculum. So fish have gills. Remember, that's one of the main characteristics. They were pharyngeal pouches at one point, but in fish they do develop into these gills. These gills have lots of blood vessels in them, okay? And so this is an area where gas exchange will take place. We know about this from we've seen this already before, like when it comes to different types of mollusks, any aquatic mollusks or invertebrates that we've looked at in the past unit. Okay, but the same thing, water typically comes in through the mouth, and this water is rich in oxygen. Will kind of flow over these gills, and these gills, because they have the blood vessels in them, that oxygen in the water goes directly into the bloodstream through these gills. And then the water that ends up leaving, or what's left, is a water that has very little oxygen in it, and that gets pushed out through the openings on the sides of the pharynx, which are those, part of those pharyngeal pouches that we mentioned. Okay, the operculum from the outside is just this large, bony kind of flap that covers those openings, and those openings in the side of the pharynx. That's what the job of that operculum is. Okay, now, if you were to look at the circulation in a fish, that's another thing that's it kind of ties in with the respiration there. You can see actually how the blood flow happens. Now you have this diagram. Of course, it's not color coded like this is because it's only in black and white, but you can detect, I think this looks darker than this in your photocopy, so you can see which is oxygen rich and which is oxygen poor. Okay, so generally the pathway is this. So you have the heart. The heart is what's going to pump the blood and allow it to circulate through the system. Fish have a closed circulatory system. Okay, so unlike a lot of invertebrates we looked at before, the blood stays inside of blood vessels throughout the whole system. That's what determines it as a closed system. So blood will get pumped by the heart, directly from the heart goes to the gills, and that's where the gas exchange happens, where the blood picks up oxygen from the water flowing in through the mouth of the fish. Okay, and you can see that by the time the blood coming in is oxygen poor, then it's oxygen rich when it leaves the gills. Okay, from the gills, the blood travels to the rest of the body. Okay, and all of these are just supposed to represent blood vessels that are feeding various areas of the body. Okay, but you can see in each of these areas there's a transition from red to blue. Okay, so this is just supposed to represent that the tissues are using up the oxygen in the blood. Okay, it's going to where it needs to go. Eventually, that blood lacking in oxygen or having poor oxygen will flow back to the heart, and then that heart will pump that blood again to the gills and so on. So that's the pathway that this blood will flow. Okay. In terms of movement, like I mentioned before, the fins of the fish provide better control, better movement when it comes to swimming. However, I should point out something right here in the middle. You can see a large structure. That's a swim bladder. Now, because body tissues are more dense than the water that fish are swimming in, sinking can be a problem for fish. So in order to allow bony fish to be able to keep some buoyancy, many bony fish have this basically like a little balloon or pouch that can be filled with air, filled with gas. Okay, and it's internal. It's right in the middle, and they can adjust how much gas is in that swim bladder, just like you would add or release air from like a pool floaty. Kind of the same idea. It's a way for the fish to adjust its buoyancy depending on how deep or how close to the surface it wants to swim. Okay, all right, so that's it for the form and function. We're going to finish off by just briefly talking about the groups of fishes. All living fishes can be classified into one of three groups. The first group are jawless fishes. Then you have cartilaginous fishes. And lastly, we have bony fishes. All right, so jawless fishes, aptly named, they do not have either, they have no true teeth or jaws. Okay, their skeletons are actually made up of fibers and cartilage. Okay, they don't have any vertebrae. And the notochords that are developed when they are embryos stay with them. They keep them even in their adult form. So that provides some form of structure, gives them some kind of similar to a backbone, but not as rigid. Now there are two groups, two classes of modern jawless fishes. The first are lampreys, which in my opinion are like absolutely terrifying. This is the mouth of a lamprey. The rest of its body just, I don't have a picture here, but it's just kind of like a long eel-like. Looks very similar to those, what were they called? Sorry. To the lancelets that we saw earlier. Similar body shape, okay? They look kind of eel-like, but they don't have a jaw. They do have these rows and rows of teeth, which are absolutely terrifying. And they are terrifying for a reason. And a lot of times lampreys are parasitic. They will kind of latch on to other animals and bite in and either consume their flesh or drink like fluids. So yeah, really terrifying. Anyway, so that's lampreys. And then there are also hagfish. Okay, not the prettiest organism. But yes, these are both modern jawless fishes. Okay, in terms of like characteristics between them, we won't go any further than the fact that they just don't have jaws, they don't have vertebrae, and anything that we just listed on the previous slide. Okay, the majority of this is going to be of this unit is going to be on the next two groups. So sharks and their relatives. Now, the class for this is pronounced chondrichthyes, or chondrichthyes. I always pronounce that wrong. Chondrichthyes. Chondro is Greek for cartilage, so that's what this beginning part of it means. And that just reminds you that all of these sharks and their relatives, their skeletons are made completely out of cartilage. Okay, so they don't have bony skeletons like we do. Okay, there's a wide variety of organisms in this class. Sharks, rays, skates, which look similar to these, sawfish, and chimeras are all different types of sharks and their relatives. Okay, and they all have cartilage as their main skeleton. Bony fishes are the third group, and this class is pronounced ostic, ostic. Oh gosh, I can't pronounce it. Osteichthyes. Oh goodness. Yeah. So let's just say bony fishes. It's a lot easier. But they're named. Their common name kind of gives the main characteristic of them, and that is that their skeletons are made up of bone. So if you were to look at them, and a lot of the fish that we consume, like you buy from the grocery store, fall under this category. If you look at their vertebral column, it's made up of bone. Not only that, but a huge group of bony fishes, almost all of them, are called ray-finned fish. And that is where, if you look at their fins, they have kind of these little spines that, hold the fins together, and you can kind of fan them out. And so those are ray-finned fish. There are a few types of bony fishes, only about like 5 or 6, maybe even 7 species in the world that are not ray-finned fish. They're called lobed fin fish, and they're like a subclass, but they have their fins look very different. They look kind of bulbous, but the majority are these ray-finned fish. Okay, there we go. So ray-finned refers to the slender bony spines or rays that that are connected by a thin layer of skin. So if you ever when you go to if you go to the grocery store, for example, and buy a whole fish, if you were to take their fins and kind of fan them out, you would see almost like this webbing between these spines. And that's the ray-finned part of it that we're talking about. Okay, I believe that is it. Yes. Okay, thank you.